Welcome everyone to the first AMO webinar of 2025, which is kind of crazy because January went by in a whole year and then February's gone by in like about a day and a half. So it has certainly been an eventful couple months. Super excited for this conversation. Obviously, I've been a very big fan of Firecrown for, I guess the brand's only 12 to 18 months old, but been fan even longer than that. And so excited to dig in here. People are filtering in, but we're just going to keep going. We've got an action-packed conversation to go. So like the title says, we are going to be digging into how Firecrown, which has bought dozens of brands over the last 4 years. I think I've lost track of how many are in the portfolio. How Firecrown has unified its audience or is unifying its audience and done that to drive pretty considerable subscription growth. Today, we are joined by Nicole McGuire, who is the Chief Operations Officer at Firecrown, who is relatively new at Firecrown, but not relatively new to the space. She was at Comeback, which Firecrown acquired in 2024. So just continuing working on those brands, plus, like I said, another couple dozen. So Nicole, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Before we jump in, I have a couple of quick things to touch on, some housekeeping rules. One, Q&A is turned on, so as we are going through this conversation, if you have clarifying questions, ask them in the Q&A box, and I will try to get them answered. And second, this is being recorded, so I will share it after the fact with everyone. So if you miss something, if you're taking notes, if you just want to come back and check it out again later, I will share this out after the fact. And finally, special thanks to Omida for making this webinar possible. Omida is an audience data platform that helps media and publishing companies, including Firecrown, get the most out of their audience data. It brings together data from web, email, social, events, and subscriptions into one platform, making it easier to turn fragmented data into actionable insights. With Omida, media companies can convert anonymous visitors into loyal subscribers and grow both subscription and ad revenue. If you're interested in learning more or want to see it in action, visit omida.com to talk to an expert or request a demo. Now, let's jump in. Normally, a discussion like this might start at the beginning, right? But I actually want to start at the end. So your boss, the owner of Firecrown, Craig Fuller, recently tweeted that Firecrown has nearly 1 million paid subscribers. That makes it one of the largest publishers from a subscription perspective. Not a ton of brands out there can say they're about to hit 1 million subscribers. So M&A played an obvious role in all this, but operationally, what had to be accomplished to get to today where you're getting so close to that 1 million number?
Right. So yes, first of all, you're correct, right? The growth that Firecrown has been driven largely by a number of acquisitions, most honestly in the last year even. But each of those acquisitions continue to bring pieces of the Firecrown operations tie together. So if you're like even just thinking accounting, production, circulation, e-commerce, I think Craig and Firecrown saw each acquisition not only acquiring the brands and the revenue that came with that, but also, their goal was to acquire sort of best in class in those different operational areas. So the rapid pace, obviously, of acquisitions has required that we make quick work of integration, but along the way, a number of teams that have joined Firecrown are very good at what they do, have a lot of experience in the space, which I think has helped. Luckily, from an operational standpoint, what we'll get into, Firecrown had already made the switch to Omida for a lot of the services, fulfillment, email, and CDP. Combach was in the process of doing that same thing, unbeknownst, right? Serendipity. So it certainly enabled us to move much faster than we otherwise could have. And then, like you had mentioned, and I'll point out, the subscriptions and e-commerce teams, they just joined Firecrown this past summer when I did as well. So we're still relatively new to Firecrown. So admittedly, some of this is still in motion, some of it's further along than others, but we've made great strides even in that short period of time.
We work in the media industry, and things never quite get to the finish line. There's always one more thing that has to get done. There's always one more. We're never shipping 100%. We're striving.
Right.
Can you talk through, as you think about all this disparate audience data, all these different brands, right? Combat comes in, Firecrown's already got a number of brands. There's probably more brands that are coming in even, over the next number of months. Can you talk through the biggest challenge you've all had to face when it comes to handling all this disparate audience data?
Yeah, I mean, even stepping back with Kalmbach, and I'm sure the case too with Firecrown prior to their move is having a lot of different systems across the different brands, even the fulfillment being separate from the customer data platform. Systems were good in their own right for what they did, but it was a real challenge to get them to talk to each other and have that visibility of data across brands, and certainly across categories, right? Outside of those verticals. And then we had to feed data into an email service provider. And so we previously spent a considerable amount of time verifying data connections, not trusting the accuracy of our own first party data after it left one platform to the next platform, right? We found much got lost in translation. And it's such a time suck, really, when it comes to marketing. And with all those data feeds, you're never really in full, really real time either. So as you can imagine, when we're faced with trying to grow conversions, you want to leverage all these audiences we have, we were kind of flying blind. We had multiple things to promote within a category, or even if you want to cross promote outside the category, but the ability to pinpoint, what's the next best thing for that individual is nearly impossible. It's, we would go with what's your next best thing? What do you think? But not based on the data or their activity, more so, well, this has an affinity, most likely it's going to be this. So there was a real opportunity cost of presenting the wrong thing, right? Because when you're competing with subscriptions and product and events and direct sold advertising, all of those things that we have, and then you present a subscriber with a subscription offer, it's not a really good look. You missed the boat. So this is especially felt too when you have several brands within a category, which is, kind of what we have at Firecrown. We've got our trains, we have our aviation, the boating and the sailing. You look at trains, we've got trains.com, which has 6 brands on one website, which is phenomenal from a trains.com, URL. But when you consolidate those 6 sites, it became really clear that we needed a better solution if we were going to grow subscriptions and memberships and work together on that site most effectively to grow together.
And so by unifying this data and continuing to unify it, what does that unlock that having all this fragmented, data didn't? Is it purely operational efficiency? Like what, is it new opportunities for product launches? Like what are you unlocking by having this kind of unified data strategy?
Certainly operationally, right? You're not spending time trying to make sense of the data when it's in living in these siloed places. But we need all those data points to ensure that the success of the marketing campaigns. It's impossible to analyze the data, right? When you're spending so much time making your systems connect. Having that one source of truth, so having the fulfillment, your customer data platform, and your email service provider, we could also finally move with ease across those functions. Like nothing gets lost in translation. Any promotion can be informed by the same underlying data, which is a beautiful thing. And we're still unlocking this. We're working to fully leverage the tools, continue to build our knowledge. But I think the key is it's unifying the data, but also making those connections and then having the tools to do something with that. So if you're, what we found is, you can have a wonderful CDP, but if it doesn't have the tools to action and you're doing analysis here, and then you're trying to take it there, it just wasn't working. Certainly not at the pace that we needed it to. And when we talk about data, like I said, we have so many opportunities to collect it on our audiences when we have so many brands and so many, with email signups, the subscriptions, the product purchases, because we do quite a bit on the e-commerce side, the site behavior, the articles viewed, virtual events attended, yada yada. But being able to tie that together and cross the brands is wonderful. And it's amplified obviously when you have more brands and when you have crossover and similarities, this is a huge area for us to even just going forward is identifying like interests across not even just the categories we're in, but outside of the categories. And we don't want to miss that chance, right, to promote the right thing. But you could see, they're a subscriber to this title, and you're viewing content on these topics, or you purchased a book on this. It just opens the door outside. Imagine, like, one of the things we're talking about is flying in space, those audiences. It would be super challenging to try to target across those categories effectively. But we have this universal behavioral script that comes with sort of setup with Omeda, which can allow us to recognize an individual across multiple sites. So cross promotion within our own database becomes much more effective as well.
So is a use case in that scenario where if a user has proven that they like flying related content, but they're on a space website, you could still offer something flying specific as like an offer, even on the space website? Is that like the use case that you would play out there?
That is what we're talking about, right? You can't, when you're talking about sort of that in that scenario previously, that would be an unknown person over here. We would just be sort of an anonymous record, right? But if we have information about you already, say on flying, for instance, oh, and now you're reading some articles on astronomy. Well, we certainly can't zap off an email necessarily from astronomy, but we do have your record. We do have your known data. Maybe you're subscribing to flying, you've purchased something. You've gone ahead and identified yourself online and given you an email. We can get a nice friendly note from flying that you might want to check out astronomy, just as an example. But I mean, I can't tell you how powerful it is to have the site behavior data living together with that first known party data. It just opens a lot of that opportunity.
And are there clear metrics, or what are the clear metrics that you're focused on as you're rolling this out to help determine success? Like, how do you know a year from now when you look back that it's working, not just like in your gut, but also like concrete metrics?
Right. I'll start with one of the things that we were looking at, very initially, and as anyone would be as if they're making those moves, and maybe it's not so much a metric, but something certainly we focused on was very important that we knew our audience, that we're able to identify them online, stitch together what we know about them. So we made an immediate focus when moving to Omeda because the audience was entirely unknown, right? So you're starting fresh, a new CDP. It's great to have all that data, but if you haven't made the connections online, there's not a whole lot you can action on from the first party data. So we became very focused on known and unknown and growing that known percentage of our audience. So we prioritize that almost immediately because, like I said, we can have all the data in the world, but if we don't know it's you when you come to the site, it's not super useful or actionable. So email signups, sweeps, meters, paywalls, site registration, all the tools to make those connections, and then the performance of those is very important to us. So whatever we were doing in those spaces, what's the conversion rate on signing someone up to an email? What's our paywall? How many articles are they viewing on the meter before we get the email? So those are the types of the data that, anything that supports conversion and retention, which is metrics we all have been tracking for years. So it's not something terribly, earth shattering, but to some extent, we recognize that the top of funnel is only going to be so big for our audiences. So how do we get smarter at engaging and converting those audiences? So online conversion rates are obviously continue to be something we measure the success of that. As we get more targeted with our promotions, we should see that improved conversion rate. And we did see some improvement there in the second half of 2024. Email click, retention rates, as we get more dynamic with our newsletter content, which is part of all of this in terms of content they're viewing, who they are, getting more personalized. And again, that's not new metrics, I think. It's just the metrics we wanted to make sure we had good baselines and that they were improving.
I want to dig in a little bit, steer a little bit away from what I was going to ask next. I want to talk a little bit about that dynamic newsletter. There's always, I've been in the newsletter space for a very long time. And there's always been like a push-pull on should every single user get the same newsletter, and it sort of be like the homepage of the cover of a newspaper where the editor serendipitously introduces information to you based off of their editorial perspective, or should you get granular and deliver customized newsletters based off of people's interests? Sounds as if Firecrown's starting to lean towards the latter, where you're starting to create much more custom based off of like behavior. Can you talk about, you mentioned that you saw some growth in subscriptions. What does that look like? What's the conversion rate look like from a dynamic newsletter, for example, compared to a static one?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of in the train space where we basically tied together, we have a lot of audience that were coming in and reading what we would deem railroad industry, right? But there's a lot going on trains.com, right? In terms of you could be modeling, you could be a Lionel fan, you could be reading industry. So identifying those audiences as railroad industry, tagging that appropriately, and then presenting them with an industry newsletter would just be an example of something that we're doing. And then that newsletter, both from a conversion perspective, but then also performance, it gets like a 14% click rate, which compared to many of our other newsletters, that's really strong. But it's just more targeted, and it's more based on the content we saw them viewing on the site and delivering something a little more targeted to what they may be interested in. So that would just be an example. I mean, in other cases, we might just be swapping out like the featured piece of content at the top, because we know you might have crossover interest as well, and we don't want to not have that particularly in a newsletter, but maybe the first piece of content is a little more geared to what we know about you, and you kind of fall into like a brand category, if you will, but we still would have other related content and things for them to explore as well.
So the idea is by dynamically inserting some of this content, you're getting a higher click-through rate, which then if we continue to follow that user flow, higher click-through rate means higher stoppage rate with the metered wall, which means theoretically an increase in the number of people who are subscribing. Is that like,
right?
Is that the like
right.
the whole?
Yeah, to see it through. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to go back a little bit and talk about, I know this is an Omeda sponsored webinar, and we're going to keep saying Omeda, but kind of if we think about it a little bit broader, after you started looking at all these brands and started bringing the data together, can you talk through the steps you've had to take to unify that audience data? Was there what's the back end work look like? What have your marketing teams had to do? Like, what is involved in actually going from, let's say, 24 different brands, I think it's more than that, to like this unified system?
Yeah, I mean, and still a work in progress, but we're very close. and that the Kalmbach titles are at Omeda, but not on the same instance. So but it will be a faster move because they are there. But Omeda is a huge component to this, right? It's with the underlying data feeding all of the different platforms, it really did and does start with the fulfillment conversion. And that is something, most people on this call have experienced probably a fulfillment conversion if they've been in the circulation or area at that point. So they've probably experienced also an email conversion, a database move. We did all of those in one. No small lift, but we did tackle those together. But that process really from a fulfillment perspective is one of just validating data on both ends, right? They're getting into the same system. And then what you do once they're there is these vertical merges, which in essence are sort of removing any duplicates that aren't easily matched immediately, right? So we went through that. We continue to do it every other month just to keep that data as, we said, unique as possible to the individual. But that was the biggest lift really is one that is not unfamiliar in this space. And it was really the fulfillment conversion, which we saw as, obviously essential in getting those three things together. I think the other where we are in that is that all of the Firecrown aviation and marine titles are together now, and again, interchangeable from whoever they are, whatever their behavior is known to us at an individual level. We're in the process of onboarding all of the AIM marine brands. So, and the immediate decision was to move them to Omeda. So in the next few months, they'll be on and in that same instance as well, which will now have a tremendous footprint in the marine space. So that opportunity to cross promote, but also kind of navigate the different brands and audiences will be very important. And then the Kalmbach hobby brands are the next step of that, is just moving them over into that same instance. So we have them all together, which should be a much simpler process since we are already at Omeda. The only other piece of that, because again, it's the unifying of the data, but it's, tying together all that behavioral piece as well. So implementing the script on our websites, which, is creating the anonymous records, typical of a CDP, right, in the database, storing the web behavior, such as the articles viewed, basically allowing us to track the behaviors and then work to get them identified on the site so we can stitch it all together. But that's been sort of where we've been and living in some part of that process for the last year, perhaps.
And when do you see this portion of the unification of data, kind of that project wrapping up? Like, at what point do you look at this and go, okay, we're ready to go full speed ahead, because we're not dealing with instance A and instance B and this,
Right.
Data out in the galaxy? Like, when are you ready?
Unification, I would say probably by summer, because I do think like the AIM titles that were on board in the marine space will be complete in the next 2 months, and then Kalmbach will follow directly after that. And so we'll have the unification piece. What we will have to work on is on the websites themselves, in terms of being able to identify user behaviors in a meaningful way. And that has a little bit more work to be done.
Well, it's good that was my next question.
Oh, great.
So we talked a little bit about how, some dynamic newsletters can help with, higher click-through rate, which means more stoppage, which means more conversions. Talk about, as you continue to gather this behavioral data on the website, what will you, from a tactical perspective, be doing to try to drive a higher conversion rate? And while the topic of this is subscriptions, you do also have e-commerce. I know that you do have some event products. Like, how is all that behavioral data going to impact your offers to folks that you want to convert to something?
Right. So I think the piece of the behavioral data that we are still collecting and strategizing around. So the first party data, unifying the data, is certainly a huge lift. Certainly, we look forward to that one instance, right? But when we talk about things like being able to target an audience in the railroad industry, it's super critical that that they're visiting articles on the site that are railroad industry related. So a lot of what we have in front of us to learn to tackle is going to be identifying those audiences within all of these categories, and audiences that are newer to a lot of folks on our team as well, and building those audience segments. Because one, we have to make sure we're serving them with the content that we have on our site. And then two, we have to make sure that we're tagging and categorizing that content consistently. Because then that's when that really opens that door to be more targeted, more personalized. And we have a lot of work to do yet in that space, depending on the brand and what sites we're talking about. But naturally, it's hard to ever have a conversation not come back to content being key. And that is really where we're going to be able to get more personalized, introduce more of those newsletters that drive traffic, that drive paywall hits and conversions. That is the piece, I think, from a learnings perspective, that we were like, whoa, it's time to go, let's get it on. And they were like, okay, we got to take a step back and make sure that the content and what we're collecting through those scripts is meaningful. And some of these sites have been around for decades. And, tagging strategies, we've been across sites that have 15,000 tags. Hello, AI, as we try to get that down to something that's meaningful and that we can start to bucket people in meaningful ways. One of the areas that I'll give you an example is on our trains.com has a modeling title, right? Model Railroader. And we felt it would be important to start targeting that beginner modeler in a unique way, right? Everyone coming to that site, there's so much content. But if you're new to modeling, you perhaps landed there because you want to learn how to get started in model railroading. We wanted to send that person on a unique journey, because I think just saying, hey, what you should do, you just got here, you should join the unlimited membership for $85. Probably not the best first, greeting for someone's like, what's HO, which is a scale in modeling. But we wanted to be able to target them appropriately, build an email series that would capture them in a different way, and then kind of journey them through. But our first learning was we have lots of beginner content. Of course we would, but wasn't tagged as beginner, necessarily organized in that way. So we just, had to step back and start to do that. And that's an opportunity that we're still building on.
How are you using AI to go through those 15,000 tags and try to narrow it down? Like, how are you doing that? Because that is a big process, especially for legacy publishers that have been doing this for a while.
We are exploring options for both narrowing it down, but then on the flip side, we also have to then go make those updates to the actual content to apply those tags to content where it fits. So I think there are tools there. So we're working with our IT folks to try to figure out how best to implement what we want to do. And because we've got a lot more sites to follow, and the time investment would be, huge to kind of do that on our own.
And as you think about building out audience segments, do you go in with a clear idea as to, I know we want a beginner segment, we want an intermediate segment, we want the expert segment, using modeling as an example? Or is it a bit more of a dynamic segment? If user does X, Y, and Z, they're now part of this segment. Like how do you all think about those various audience segments?
I think probably a little bit of both, depending on the category or the interest. Certainly in modeling, like I said, you've got that sort of beginner, intermediate, and advanced, and we have that content to serve you. And that more advanced person who's viewing content across multiple brands, and they're a perfect target for an unlimited membership, right? Versus that beginner or what have you. And so that's one way to look at it. But the other way is to create segments across the database that maybe are, I'll throw out like flying interest might be, and we would set the parameters for what qualifies you as sort of being in that bucket. So very broad level, and that's more on the cross promotion side. In some categories like aviation and boating, it might be more. And a lot of this, you can see how it also dovetails in supporting our advertising efforts on the site. Naturally, all of this work is going to be good for how we talk and retain folks, whether it be through the newsletters we serve them because they feel like we know who they are, but also the audience segments for advertising. You're a new boat owner, you're thinking of buying a plane, but we've got to make sure we can certainly ask you that through surveys and a variety of different tools on the website, but we also can infer it through the articles that you're viewing or where you came from or how you entered the site, that type of thing. So it's a little bit of a mix.
You mentioned retention. Obviously, the second half of last year, you saw growth on the subscriber side, but the biggest complaint of a subscription business is like a leaky bucket, right? You're always losing some people at the bottom. How has this allowed you to retain, or has it allowed you to retain subscribers that you might have in the past viewed as high risk churn candidates?
Yeah, I think obviously when you deliver more of what your audience enjoys, you stand a better chance of retaining them. So it helps when you know what they are enjoying, the content they're reading, what they're clicking on, tying this together, supporting them more with compelling editorial content, whether that be the ongoing newsletters. I mean, I think all of that it's all relationship building with the brand. So I think the more that we can know who they are and serve them, even as they're coming back to the websites, reading our newsletters, certainly, obviously, the quality content that's in the magazine helps support retention. And one of the things too that we haven't talked about, but it's actually going back and getting the prior subscribers that we've lost along the way, whether that be because they actively chose to leave or it was more of a what happened? I was on auto renewal, or you didn't send me a renewal, which has happened in some cases, which happens when you're converting from one thing to the next. And we've had a ton of success actually just targeting prior subscribers. That I would call it probably low hanging fruit, but frankly, before having our data together, we were never really even to action on the low hanging fruit. So knowing that you're a prior subscriber and you're still on the website, you're reading articles, you actually open and read your newsletter, you might even be subscribing to a sister title. We've been able to target them on the website when they're there and deliver messaging that's unique to them, like through a pop-up or what have you. And it's talking to them. Not in a creepy way, I don't think, but in a way we know who you are, we welcome you back, and that we've seen really strong conversion on that. And frankly, I think that supported a lot of our growth in the second half of 2024 is just intentionally thinking about how to reach those folks that we've lost along the way.
You mentioned sister title, and we've talked a little bit about how if you are a flying reader, but then you're on, the astronomy side of things, you can do crossover promotion. Have you been able to, or are you going to be able to create sort of dynamic bundles for people where if they are reading flying and they're reading trains, you could offer them a bundle where you can get those two publications as a somewhat discounted subscription? Is that something that you've explored, that you're thinking of doing, are doing, that this allows for? Just kind of curious.
Yeah, and I think I have some friends on the call who are going, "Oh, yeah, bundles." Bundles are definitely something we've been exploring and talking through. We haven't gotten to a place of the dynamic piece of it, but absolutely. We're soon, when everything's together, truly together, we're going to have that ability to sort of serve up and work with Omida on what that looks like from an order form perspective and the pages that can be created dynamically. But yes, because right now you'll see we have a lot of cross promotion of one or the other or bundles, but taking it to the actual order pages and offers is something kind of on our list as cross promotion in general. I think, as I mentioned earlier, just I think it's a huge opportunity for us.
So we've talked a little bit, or quite a bit, about tactics on the marketing side, the audience side, building out these segments and all that. But you said when we started, content is the biggest reason anyone subscribes. And so how has all of this audience data and the behavioral data sort of filtered to the editorial teams to help inform what coverage they do to continue driving subscriptions? Is that happening, and how is it happening?
Yes. So our audience development team is in constant dialogue with our editorial team, talking through what's working, what's not working. We provide them with any analysis, especially as it comes to content consumption that leads to conversion, right? So we're looking at the types of content, the categories that are driving conversion, and we will pull back in areas where we're not seeing that and deliver more in the areas that we are. We've done a lot of that with the membership model on trains.com because we have meters and paywalls that are super important to that model. And we can see, when they're hitting the meter, when they're hitting the paywall, what converts. We talked about the newsletters. So having a beginner series and thinking that that's a good path, and working with them on a multi-part email series that's geared towards beginners, talking through the things like the industry newsletter and delivering content in that space, but also all the tagging work that we're going to do. And we've done a lot of this already, but making sure that going forward, when we're tagging and categorizing content, because they're posting to the websites daily, right, that we continue to think about the strategy behind what we're doing with those tags, and that we're doing it in a meaningful way that we'll be able to ultimately use it to deliver to those audiences. That's just dialogue that we have on a regular basis with those teams.
One last question about the various revenue streams. So obviously, Firecrown, very diversified: subscriptions, advertising, e-commerce, events. I'm sure the flying has the finance business. As you unify all this audience data, how do you inform the priority of monetization, right? Obviously, you probably have behavior that says if someone's doing X, they're more likely to subscribe. But for your most loyal people, how are you deciding that they should be a subscriber offer versus an e-commerce offer? Is it purely behavioral? Are there do you have internally a mandate that says, like, if it's between e-commerce and subscription, push subscription first? How does that all play out?
No internal mandate that I'm aware. I will say that we generally do prioritize the subscription, the recurring revenue, and then drive the product purchases based on the interest. Now, we do have opportunities on the site today, on the content sites. The products that we present are informed by the behavior of the user, right? So it's not to say that we're not using that data in an everyday sort of visit experience to drive product, but we've just had more success with and see most of our subscribers than from a loyalty perspective, from a relationship building perspective, the subscription, the revenue there first, and then driving the product purchase from that. I just think that we have typically seen that the trust and the loyalty and the content brand can then drive the product. But that's been a priority for us from a growth perspective, and that's kind of where we have focused our conversion energy for sure.
We have a viewer question. What they're curious about is it's very, very focused on Omeda. Why did you decide to choose Omeda as the platform? And were there other platforms that you considered?
And we could have a fully probably I don't know if it's a webinar, but a full-on offline conversation that we could go into that. But I'll kind of go back to my original Omeda from the standpoint, obviously was a top runner because of the amount of effort, time, and work our team was doing when it was different systems. So certainly, and if you asked me 5 years ago, that would have made me nervous. All eggs in one basket. What are you doing? Best of class in each one. And that had been our approach until data became just so much more critically important, and all of the data about that audience and having that in one place. I mean, even if you think about email and it's data, but it's also the segmentation of it. It's increasingly more important for your reputation, right? That those emails be more targeted and personalized and based on user data. If you want to maintain those reputations, there's things like that that were just becoming increasingly more difficult to do when it's in different places. Omeda obviously rose to the top more recently than it would have for me in the past because I think it was seen as more of a B2B. And, we're obviously very heavily B2C, but as that was changing and I was learning more about their platform and truly the unified data in a real way was not happening in where we were before. They became very appealing. They're not the only ones we looked at, but they were the furthest along on the customer data platform side of things, where we saw that the growth in our business and where we needed to focus was going to be less on operational subscription fulfillment. I mean, that can be done in any place that we looked at and done well enough to serve the subscriber copies. It really had to be more about who was looking more into the future about how we were going to do all the things that we were just talking about in this call. And that, to me, from a CDP perspective, they did rise to the top, best of class in that area. And that is just where we prioritized our direction. I hope that helps.
A follow-up question. Are you able to share any information on how Omeda kind of charges for a business? Are they taking transaction fees? Are they involved in the advertising transactions at all? Like how does that fit from a financial perspective?
Also in terms of like how the cost of service type thing. Yeah. They look at it as a license fee. So based on the size of your business, the data you're collecting, what you would expect if you've ever, RFP to CDP, and then of course you've got the fulfillment piece in there. So size of your files, your subscriber files, but largely too, like the data that you're going to be collecting, how big is that? How many records do you think you're going to have? That type of thing.
Another question. This is an anonymous attendee. We have a subscription tier that features print subscriptions, and most data platforms we've looked into solely focus on online data and digital memberships. How does Firecrown incorporate or manage data for physical products like print subscriptions or e-com products? Particularly interested in how it works with fulfillment systems, whether using a platform like Shopify or a unique system that you might have designed.
So all the subscription fulfillment, which we're obviously still very much in print, We do have a digital membership, but all of our titles have a print subscription as well. And all of that fulfillment, all of our orders, order processing, et cetera, goes to Amita for fulfillment. I think that's what they're asking.
And what about e-commerce? So like if you're selling things, I know you have
Yeah,
the space store. Like if
yeah.
you're selling things, how does that data kind of filter back in and what sort of interactions are there?
Yeah, so we are on Shopify for the most part for our e-commerce, but then we feed all of that data into the Omita CDP so that we have that purchase history as well as any other subscription history we might have. And again, the site behavior piece of that.
Cool. Well, those were our Q&A questions. If anyone has anything else up, but I'm going to move us to the wrap up of this conversation. To both of you who asked those questions, if you want to email me after this, I'd be happy to make some introductions for you to get more concrete information, specifically about Omita. But back to Firecrown, what comes next? So we talked by summer, you're going to have all this data completely unified. It's going to be a beautiful system. You're going to be thrilled. Then what?
I was going to say, your guess is as good as mine. But no,
My guess better not be as good as yours because I'm not inside your office.
oh boy, no. But for the foreseeable future, like you said, we've got our work cut out for us. Totally get to that place. But I think as a company, while there still may be a few acquisitions, because our boss really likes to buy things, which is great, the focus is going to turn more into organic growth. So the work that we're doing to unify the data that we would have wanted to do regardless, really, I think will position us well. Building those audiences, unifying the data, the segments, all of that's going to support growth, both within subscriptions, certainly, but outside of subscriptions. So we're going to leverage those audiences to support new events. We're looking at expanding our book business. And, again, that's going to be largely what are the audiences we can serve. So the more we know about those audiences, the more we're going to be able to support organic growth. And I would say the other piece of that is we have gained a lot of learnings through digital membership and the train side. So looking at aviation, looking at marine, and how do we bring membership to that as well, and cross promotion, obviously, across the brands we talked about that can support the organic growth as well.
My final question, thinking a little bit more broadly, if another media company is struggling to unify its audience data, where do you recommend they start on the process? Besides, obviously, choose Omita, but besides that, where do you recommend they start? How do they get this process going?
I mean, I won't say Omita. I mean, you've got to go through the process for your business and your struggles, but you do have to look at the platforms you're using. If you're struggling to make it work, and if anything here sound like I don't know if we can do that, it's probably not you. We've been through that sort of point in our teams, right? And moves and conversions they're time consuming. There's no doubt about it, but there's an opportunity cost of not making a switch or a change. If you're working with subscriber and expire data, you're probably very familiar with it. But if you need to be on platforms that really understand the nuances of that type of data so you can work with it. But you've got to have the basics covered. Otherwise, I think it'll always be a struggle to marry the data piece of it. But yeah, unifying the data it's critical. And then making sure you have the right tools to mobilize to make that data work for you. Like we talked about, I think making those decisions, asking yourself if the platforms have that capability and you're just not tapping into it, but making those decisions and moves. And, inevitably you'll have to look at your website. As I mentioned, we are the CMS that you're using, the content organization. Is it in a place where you'll be able to leverage it when that data is available to you? Or is there probably almost like an in tandem process that needs to be happening to help support your audience segmentation and the personalization tools that you'll have available to you?
Well, that's awesome. That is all the time we have for today. I promised we would get this done in 45 minutes, and we have just hit the 45th minute. So, Nicole, thank you so much for chatting with us about this. I learned a ton. So thank you.
No, thank you for having me. It's fun.
Of course.
Great.
Of course. Special thanks to Omida for making this webinar possible. Unifying audience data and using that to help you grow revenue is a core part of what Omida does. So I would encourage everyone to check out omida.com to request a demo, especially those couple of folks who asked some questions. I think both of what you were thinking about is probably a good place to start. And finally, thank you to everyone here. If you have thoughts, please shoot me a note anytime, jacob@amediaoperator.com. I will have the recording for this over the next 24 hours, most likely, though I am traveling right now. So, as always, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day and take care.
Thank you.